Between 1978 and 1996, hidden away in the hills of Vernon Township, New Jersey, there existed a place unlike anywhere else in America. It was part amusement park, part water park, and part uncontrolled experiment. A place that stood on the side of a mountain like a dare made real.
There's nothing in the world like Action Park.
To the kids who grew up with it, it was a kingdom of summer freedom. To parents, lawyers, doctors, and eventually investigators, it was something else entirely. By the end of the day, visitors often left sunburned, exhausted, bruised, bleeding, or worse. This was chaos with an admission fee. To some people, it was the greatest amusement park ever built. To others, it was one of the most dangerously irresponsible places ever opened to the public. Over the course of its existence, thousands of people were injured there. Hundreds were seriously hurt. At least 6 people lost their lives. And somehow, despite all of that, people still remember it with a strange kind of affection. It was reckless but enticing, dangerous beyond belief, and, for many who survived it, the greatest place they ever went as children. This was Action Park. Before it became a legend, Action Park began as a business problem. Eugene Mulvihill, the businessman behind Great American Recreation, owned the Vernon Valley and Great Gorge ski areas in New Jersey. In winter, the mountain made sense. Snow fell, skiers arrived, and money came in. But once the weather warmed and the slopes turned green, the resort became quiet, and quiet mountains do not pay the bills. Mulvihill needed summer crowds. So in the 1970s, he began adding attractions to the mountain. First came an Alpine Slide, then 2 water slides, then go-karts. By the end of 1978, he had the beginnings of his summer revenue. At first, the place opened under the fairly forgettable name of Vernon Valley Summer Park. But as the crowds grew and the rides became bigger, louder, and more ambitious, the park was eventually given a new name, Action Park. And action was exactly what it promised. But unlike traditional amusement parks where guests simply sat down, buckled in, and let a machine carry them safely from beginning to end, Action Park had a different philosophy. Here the rider was part of the ride. You controlled the speed. You steered the cart. You chose when to brake, when to jump, and when to let go. And sometimes whether you had any business being there in the first place. Mulvihill believed that this was exactly what made the park exciting. As his son later explained, the whole idea came from skiing itself. Skiing was thrilling because you were in control. And Action Park tried to bring that same feeling to an amusement park. It was an idea that sounded plausible on paper. In practice, it meant thousands of people were handed control of rides that could hurt them very badly if anything went wrong. And at Action Park, things went wrong constantly. Giving thousands of excited teenagers control over high-speed rides turned out to be exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Locals eventually came up with their own nickname for the place, Traction Park. Others simply called it Friction Park. Even the television adverts felt chaotic. Fast-talking announcers screamed over footage of children flying down water slides and crashing through wave pools with the same frantic energy as the old Crazy Eddie commercials. Everything about Action Park felt loud, excessive, and slightly unhinged before you'd even walk through the gates. For kids and teenagers, it felt enormous. Every summer, families drove up into the Vernon Hills with towels piled in the back seats and kids already wearing their swimming trunks before the car had even parked. Teenagers poured through the gates in groups, pockets stuffed with just enough money for a treat or two, desperate to get on the Alpine Slide before the queues became unbearable. The whole place smelled like chlorine, hot concrete, petrol fumes, and Bactine. Music echoed across the mountain while lifeguards shouted over the noise of roaring water and revving engines. It was the kind of place where parents let their children disappear for hours. No phones, no tracking apps, no constant check-ins, just a vague instruction to meet back near the entrance later, and then the children were gone, swallowed by the mountain. For those who remember it fondly, that freedom is the part that still glows. But beneath that glow was something much darker. The Alpine Slide was the first real warning sign that Action Park was operating by its own rules. It opened in 1976 within an area nicknamed the Alpine Centre, which eventually hosted all of the park's land-based, non-vehicular gravity rides. Stretching around 2,700 feet down the side of Hamburg Mountain, the ride looked deceptively simple. Riders climbed into small wheeled sleds and hurtled downhill through a twisting track carved directly into the mountain. A single handbrake controlled the speed. Pull back to slow down, push forward to go faster. That was the theory anyway. In reality, the brakes didn't always work properly. And even when they did, people often ignored them completely. Teenagers flew into corners far too fast, leaning the wrong way or not leaning at all, while the sleds rattled violently beneath them. One former employee later joked that the Alpine Slide only had two speeds, slow and death awaits. He wasn't entirely wrong. The track was lined with concrete, rocks and unforgiving bends. If a rider lost control, the sled could jump the track completely, throwing them straight onto the surface below. Most people were wearing little more than swimming trunks, bikinis or cheap rubber sandals, with no helmets and no real protection of any kind. Skin met concrete at speed, and the mountain took its payment. Visitors quickly learned that leaving Action Park without some kind of injury was almost unusual. The most common souvenir was something regulars nicknamed a strawberry, a raw friction burn caused where bare skin scraped at speed across the Alpine Slide's concrete and fiberglass track. As if that wasn't bad enough, parts of the ride were also lined with asbestos. Many came away with arms, backs, shoulders and legs scraped raw. Others left with broken bones, concussions and head injuries. Between 1984 and 1985 alone, the Alpine Slide was linked to dozens of fractures and serious head injuries. Locals eventually gave the wounds another nickname, Action Park Tattoos, and somehow that almost became part of the attraction. Kids compared burns and scrapes like trophies. Some people were genuinely frightened of the slide. Others headed straight back to the queue to do it all over again. At the top of the ride, there were reportedly boards displaying photographs of previous injuries, though even that did little to discourage riders. If anything, it seemed to make the whole thing feel more legendary. And by the end of busy summer days, staff later recalled sections of the track coated in blood and shredded skin. And, as if the ride itself wasn't chaotic enough, the old ski lift still passed overhead. Riders on the chairs above would sometimes spit down at the people below, or worse, while the sleds continued rattling down the mountain underneath. It was treacherous, it was badly designed, and people got hurt on it constantly. And yet for many who went there, the Alpine Slide is still the first thing they fondly remember when they think about Action Park. But for some families, the Alpine Slide became associated with something far worse than cuts and bruises. In 1980, 19-year-old George Larson Jr. was thrown from his cart and suffered catastrophic head injuries after striking a rock beside the track. He died several days later in hospital. Afterwards, Action Park's founder, Gene Mulvihill, reportedly told newspapers that Larson had been an employee riding the slide after hours in wet conditions. But that account was deeply misleading. George wasn't an Action Park employee. He had previously worked at one of Mulvihill's ski resorts during winter, but on the day of the accident he was simply visiting the park with a friend, like thousands of other young people that summer. Critics later accused Mulvihill of using that distinction to avoid greater scrutiny at a time when employee fatalities were handled differently under New Jersey regulations, as it wasn't mandatory to report them. For the Larson family, though, those details changed nothing. A teenager had gone to Action Park for a day out and never came home. And somehow that still wasn't enough to slow the crowds down. That was the strange spell the park cast over people. By 1978, the little collection of rides on the mountain was beginning to grow into something far more ambitious. The first water attractions formally opened on July the 4th, and by 1979 the place was exploding with massive new construction projects. This expansion created Waterworld, which became one of North America's very first modern water parks, and people absolutely flocked to it. Over the next few months, more and more rides appeared across the mountain. And at Action Park, The stranger and more dangerous an idea sounded, the better. Eugene Mulvihill reportedly sketched ride concepts onto napkins before having friends weld them together, often with little or no involvement from actual engineers. Why spend the money when, in his mind, the responsibility for staying safe belonged to the customer? By the mid-1980s, more than 1 million people a year were pouring through the gates, drawn by around 75 rides, slides, pools, tracks, and strange inventions scattered across the mountain. Everywhere you looked, there was noise and movement. As the crowds grew larger, the water attractions became increasingly overcrowded. So in 1980, the park expanded across Route 94 to open an entirely new section dedicated to motorized attractions. Even the road was dragged into this never-ending madness. And at Action Park, if somebody came up with an idea that sounded vaguely thrilling and only moderately survivable, there was a very good chance somebody would try to build it. One of the strangest attractions the park ever attempted was something known as the Bailey Ball. The idea was simple in the most terrifying possible way. Strap a person inside a giant steel sphere fitted with wheels and send them rolling downhill along a track built into the mountain. The thing reportedly looked like pure nightmare fuel. Part carnival ride, part naval mine. According to former employees, the ride was being demonstrated to a state inspector when the summer heat caused sections of the PVC trap to warp. Midway through the test, the Bailey Ball jumped the track completely, and it didn't stop. The huge steel sphere rolled down the mountainside, crossed Route 94, and eventually disappeared into a swamp on the other side of the road. Some stories claim the inspector simply watched the whole thing happen in silence before turning around and leaving. The ride was abandoned soon afterwards. And somehow even this fit perfectly into the strange world of Action Park. Because the terrifying thing about the Bailey Ball was not just how absurd it sounded, it was the fact that it nearly became real. In most amusement parks, ideas like that would probably die in a meeting room. At Action Park, they were welded together, pushed downhill, and tested on actual human beings first. And that same reckless energy could be found everywhere else across the mountain. Motorworld housed some of the park's most infamous attractions, and in many ways it captured the entire philosophy behind Action Park perfectly. Speed was encouraged, rules felt optional, and the line between thrilling and reckless often disappeared completely. The go-karts had their own reputation almost immediately. On paper, they were supposed to be limited to a safe speed, but Action Park was not the sort of place where limits lasted very long. Staff and guests quickly discovered ways to bypass the built-in governors, sometimes by wedging a tennis ball into the mechanism, allowing the carts to reach speeds approaching 50 miles per hour. At that point, they were no longer really go-karts. They were small, petrol-powered missiles being driven by teenagers in swimming trunks. And not always sober ones either. Motorworld sat only a short distance from the park's beer stands, and stories of drunk or underage guests climbing into the carts became part of Action Park folklore. Crashes were frequent, so were fights, shouting matches, and clouds of petrol fumes hanging over the track in the summer heat. The smell alone was something people still remember. Petrol, hot engines, burning rubber, and exhaust fumes baking into the mountain air, while carts screamed around corners inches from each other. Sometimes the fuel caps would fly loose mid-race, spraying petrol backwards onto drivers behind them. Others became nauseous just from breathing in the fumes for too long. Amazingly, people still queued for it. Another popular Motorworld attraction looked like something a child might dream up after watching too many war films on a Saturday afternoon. Battle-action tanks gave visitors the chance to drive small motorized tanks around an arena while firing tennis balls from mounted cannons at each other. If you managed to hit another tank's target, the vehicle would temporarily stop working, leaving the driver stranded while everyone else closed in around them. And the chaos didn't stop there. Around the edge of the arena, spectators could fire tennis balls from static cannons mounted along the perimeter, meaning people weren't just under attack from the tanks themselves, but from the crowd watching outside as well. Employees later admitted it was one of the least popular rides to work on. Like so much else at Action Park, it sounded ridiculous, and people absolutely loved it. It felt less like a carefully managed amusement park, and more like controlled bedlam. sometimes not even particularly controlled. Part endurance test and part fever dream. And for a generation of kids growing up in the 80s, it was paradise. That was the strange logic of Action Park. The danger wasn't hidden away from visitors. Most of the time it was right there in front of them, loud and obvious and impossible to ignore. The danger often made the place feel even more exciting. You weren't just sitting safely inside the experience. You were part of the chaos. Even the attractions that sounded harmless somehow became exhausting ordeals. Over on the little-known Fantasy Island, the human maze was simply a giant labyrinth built from stacked hay bales. But at Action Park, it turned into this bizarre mixture of endurance test, panic room, and dark comedy sketch. In the middle of summer, the trapped heat inside the maze became suffocating. People became genuinely lost for hours at a time, emerging drenched in sweat and desperately asking for water. One attendant later admitted he would never go in himself without a rope tied around his waist. And because this was Action Park, even the maze came with its own strange hazards. Snakes occasionally slipped into the hay bales, suddenly appearing beside terrified guests and sending them sprinting deeper into the maze in blind panic. At one point, after repeated incidents and complaints, a sign reportedly appeared near the entrance with a single word written across it: danger, which in many ways might as well have been the slogan for the entire park. Waterworld was where the mountain became truly chaotic. The air smelled of chlorine and sun cream, while the sound of screaming and splashing and tinny loudspeaker announcements echoed through the hills from morning until dusk. Jimmy Buffett blasted through loudspeakers. Lifeguards shouted over roaring water. Kids sprinted barefoot over hot concrete, carrying inflatable tubes, while sunburnt parents collapsed into deck chairs nearby. Everywhere you looked, people were throwing themselves into something. Into freezing pools, into speeding rafts, into artificial rapids, into rides that felt less like carefully engineered attractions and more like dares somebody had somehow managed to build. Even among all the madness of Action Park, the Cannonball Loop was the ride people spoke about in half disbelief, like an urban legend that somehow turned out to be real. It looked like something drawn by a child who had never been told the word no. An enclosed water slide with a full vertical loop at the bottom. A loop on a roller coaster is one thing. A loop on a water slide, where a human body is the vehicle, is something else entirely. If a rider entered the loop with enough speed, they might make it around. If they did not, they could stall near the top and drop straight down inside the tube. Injuries were almost inevitable. Broken noses, back injuries, cuts, and battered faces became part of the ride's short and infamous life. One early rider later recalled emerging bloodied and shaken, while others reportedly came out with strange cuts that nobody could quite explain at first. Later, staff allegedly discovered teeth embedded into the padded interior walls from previous riders who had smashed their mouths against the slide. There were stories of test dummies coming out damaged, of teenage employees being offered money to try it, and of riders emerging shaken, bleeding, or worse. An emergency hatch had to be added so that people who failed to complete the loop could be removed from inside the slide. The Cannonball Loop only operated for a brief period before state officials forced it to close, but by then it hardly mattered. Some rides became famous because they last for decades. The Cannonball Loop became famous simply because it existed at all. And Action Park had plenty more. There was the Tarzan Swing, one of the park's most famous attractions, where visitors grabbed hold of a thick rope and swung out across the water while crowds gathered nearby to watch. On hot summer days, long queues formed beside the rocks, and kids could be seen hopping from foot to foot on hot concrete, waiting for their turn. Some launched themselves confidently into the air. Others hesitated at the edge, while their friends shouted at them to just do it. The difficult part was knowing exactly when to let go. Release too early, and you dropped awkwardly into the water below. Hold on too long, and you risked swinging straight into the concrete edge on the far side of the pool. Some people landed flat on their backs with a painful smack that everyone nearby could hear. Others limped away clutching twisted ankles or bruised ribs, while the next group stepped forward laughing. And then there was the water itself. Because the pool was fed directly from mountain springs, it stayed freezing cold even in the middle of summer. The drop from hot summer air into freezing water could steal the breath from your body in an instant. Some surfaced laughing in shock. Others came back up gasping and panicking, suddenly realizing they could barely breathe at all. And then, unbelievably, many of them climbed straight back out and queued to do it again. But one man never got the chance to do it again. He died in 1984 after suffering a fatal heart attack after using the Tarzan swing. It is unofficially believed that the cardiac arrest was triggered by the extreme shock of the water temperature. Elsewhere, artificial rapids carried rafts through narrow concrete channels lined with rocks and low overhangs that left riders bruised, bloodied, or clutching shoulders and knees that they had slammed against the sides just moments earlier. And then there was Surf Hill. Long, wet lanes stretched downhill while riders hurled themselves forward on foam mats, skimming across the surface at ridiculous speeds, as spectators gathered nearby waiting for the inevitable collisions at the bottom. One particular lane earned the nickname the Backbreaker, thanks to a vicious bump halfway down that launched riders briefly into the air before slamming them back down again. People got hurt on it constantly. Nearby sat the super speedboats, another attraction where guests were given far more control than they probably should have had. Unsurprisingly, many riders treated them like bumper boats, smashing into each other at speed, while spectators watched from the shoreline. Some riders were too tall to fit in the boats, so they sat with their legs over the sides. Bumper boats and dangling limbs do not bode well, and the inevitable broken bones and other injuries occurred on a regular basis. Action Park's unofficial slogan soon became, "Where you're the centre of the accident." There was also the kayak experience, a simulated white water ride where guests paddled small kayaks through an artificial rapids course powered by underwater fans. Compared to some of the other attractions, it sounded almost tame, but like so much else at the park, the danger often appeared where people least expected it. Kayaks regularly overturned or became trapped against rocks and concrete barriers, forcing riders to climb out into the rushing water to free themselves. In 1982, Jeffrey Nathan, a 27-year-old man, climbed out into the water after his kayak capsized. As he tried to steady himself, he stepped onto an electrified grate beneath the water. The electric shock sent him into cardiac arrest, and he later died in hospital. Unbelievably, even that wasn't the ride people feared most. That distinction belonged to the wave pool. From a distance it looked harmless enough. Families splashing in the shallows, rubber rings drifting across the surface, children laughing beneath the summer sun. But the people who worked there knew better. Among staff and locals it earned a far darker nickname, the grave pool. The waves were unusually powerful, and because the water was fresh rather than salt, swimmers found it much harder to stay afloat than they expected. On busy weekends the pool became dangerously overcrowded, sometimes holding close to 1,000 people at once. One moment people were laughing, the next they were struggling to keep their heads above water. Lifeguards were in a constant state of rescue. Former staff later claimed they pulled dozens of exhausted swimmers from the pool during a single weekend. And when the wave machine finally stopped, some remembered scanning the bottom of the pool in silence, checking to make sure nobody had disappeared beneath the surface. And by that point, Action Park's reputation was becoming impossible to ignore. Because for all the wild stories, all the strange inventions, all the scraped knees and outrageous memories, people died there. George Lopez, a 15-year-old who drowned in 1982. Donald DePass, 20 years old, who drowned in 1984. And Gregory Grandchamp, 18 years old, who drowned in 1987. They were not legends, rumours or punchlines. They were sons, brothers, friends and loved ones who went to a park expecting a summer day out and never came home. 6 lives were lost at Action Park, and hundreds more were changed by serious injuries. Part of the reason was the time in which Action Park existed. The late 1970s and 1980s were a different era for amusement safety. There was no internet where parents could instantly search a park's accident history before buying tickets. Local rumours spread, but not always the full truth. Many visitors knew Action Park was risky, but few understood how dangerous it had become. Another reason was the park's own philosophy. Action Park placed responsibility on the guest. If someone crashed, they must have gone too fast. If someone fell, they must not have followed instructions. If someone struggled in the water, they had overestimated their ability to swim. In a park where the guest was supposedly in control, blame could be shifted very easily onto the person who had been hurt. The staff culture did not help. Many employees were teenagers themselves, some barely old enough to be trusted with a summer job, let alone the operation of rides that could injure or kill people. New attractions were often tested by employees, sometimes with cash incentives, and once a few people had made it through alive, that could be enough for the ride to open. The first aid station became part of the Action Park experience. Guests with cuts and scrapes were sprayed with a stinging orange mixture of alcohol and iodine. There are stories of staff drawing a circle on the floor and offering a prize to anyone who could stand inside it while the solution burned into their open wounds. The prize was an Action Park pen. That detail sounds funny until you remember why first aid was so busy in the first place. The injuries became so frequent that ambulances were a familiar sight. Local hospitals knew the park well. Lawsuits began to pile up, and Action Park earned another nickname, one that captured its reputation perfectly: Class Action Park. As claims mounted throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, it emerged that Mulvihill had set up his own offshore insurance company to help shield the park from the enormous costs associated with injuries and lawsuits. The arrangement drew increasing scrutiny from authorities, while thousands of legal claims continued building against the company. Legal costs mounted. Insurance problems grew. Attendance began to suffer as the park's reputation caught up with it. By the mid-1990s, Action Park was collapsing under the weight of its own reputation. In 1996, Great American Recreation filed for bankruptcy. Action Park closed at the end of that season and did not reopen the following year. And just like that, one of the strangest amusement parks in American history was gone. Today, the mountain property still exists, returned under new ownership and a new identity. Dangerous rides were removed, changed, softened, or rebuilt. The place eventually became known as Mountain Creek Water Park, a safer and more conventional version of what had once stood there. But the legend of Action Park never really disappeared, because for all the injuries, all the lawsuits, all the terrible decisions and genuine tragedy, people still remember it. Not fondly in spite of the danger, but strangely because of it. Places like Action Park do not disappear in the ordinary way. They survive in stories. They live in scars, in old photographs, in family arguments, in documentaries, in online memories, and in the strange pride of people who can still say, "I went there." For one generation of New Jersey kids, surviving Action Park became a rite of passage. You came home scraped up, exhausted, sunburned, and carrying stories that sounded too ridiculous to be true. And maybe that's what makes Action Park so difficult to explain. It was negligent. It was reckless. At times, it was genuinely horrifying. But for the people who grew up there, it was also summer. And a dangerous place can still be woven into someone's happiest summers. A childhood can be reckless and still be cherished by the child who survived it. And that may have been the real attraction all along. Not the go-karts, or the cliff jumps, or the impossible loop. The real attraction was the feeling of being indestructible. Action Park offered children and teenagers a kind of freedom that barely exists anymore, and perhaps should not exist in quite that form again. It belonged to a rougher, looser, more careless world, a world where danger was sometimes mistaken for character and survival was treated like entertainment. There is something seductive about that memory, and there is also something deeply sad about it, because 6 people did not get to grow old and tell funny stories about the time they nearly died at Action Park. Their families were left with grief, not nostalgia. Their names should sit at the centre of the story, not at the edge of it. So it's important not to let nostalgia smooth over what happened here. Somehow, against all logic, the place became legendary, not because it was safe, and not because it was well run, but because there has never really been anywhere else quite like it. Action Park was unforgettable. Now, when I came upon this story and saw the details of some of the rides, I couldn't quite believe this place had ever existed. Part of me still doesn't believe it, but nonetheless it did. Our condolences go out to the families of those people who lost their lives there, and despite the tragic nature of those losses, I hope you appreciated the way this information was given to you. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.